leave a comment with your city name, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
The grand chamber of galactic jurisprudence rose like a crystalline cathedral above the heart of Nexus Prime, its walls inscribed with 10 million years of accumulated legal precedent. Here, beneath vaulted ceilings that stretched beyond normal dimensional boundaries, the greatest legal minds in the galaxy gathered to debate the fundamental laws that govern trillions of sentient beings across thousands of worlds. Chief Magistrate Kexthari of the Juridical Collective stood at the center of the chamber, his four arms weaving through holographic displays of legal text with practiced elegance. His species had evolved beyond physical form millennia ago, existing now as pure intellect housed within crystalline matrices designed specifically for legal reasoning. To him, the law was not merely a profession, it was the highest expression of civilized thought. "Esteemed colleagues," Kexthari began, his voice resonating through harmonics that carried legal meaning in 17 different dimensional frequencies. "We gather today to address a petition that frankly insults the very foundations of our jurisprudential tradition." Around him, representatives from the galaxy's most advanced civilizations nodded in agreement. The temporal judiciary, beings who existed across multiple timelines simultaneously and could perceive legal causality across eons. The quantum legalists, entities who understood law at the subatomic level and could draft legislation that operated on probability rather than certainty. The ethereal advocates, pure consciousness that had transcended material existence and approached law as a form of cosmic mathematics. "The petition," Kexthari continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "comes from the humans of the Sol system. They request representation in the Galactic Legal Council, claiming that the laws we create affect their civilization." A ripple of what could charitably be called laughter passed through the chamber. The concept was so absurd that several of the more advanced beings had difficulty processing it through their legal reasoning matrices. "The humans," observed Magistrate Velderan of the Temporal Judiciary, her consciousness flickering across past and future legal precedents, "are barely capable of maintaining coherent legal systems on their single planet. Their legal traditions are crude, primitive, and based on obsolete concepts like constitutional democracy and individual rights." "Indeed," agreed Counselor Nexther of the Quantum Legalists, his probability-based existence allowing him to speak with statistical certainty. "Analysis of human legal systems reveals a 99.7% probability of systematic inefficiency. Their laws are written in simple languages that any citizen can understand, completely eliminating the sophisticated complexity that defines advanced jurisprudence." Kexthari activated a holographic display showing examples of human legal documents. The chamber was filled with the sight of crude text written in basic pictographic languages, legal concepts expressed in terms so simple that even non-specialists could comprehend them. "Observe," he said, highlighting a section of Earth's Constitution. "This primitive document. It contains fewer than 8,000 words and can be read by any moderately educated human in less than an hour. Compare this to our fundamental legal framework, which requires 17 doctoral equivalencies in trans-dimensional jurisprudence merely to comprehend the basic principles." The comparison was indeed stark. Where human law was written in clear, declarative sentences, galactic law existed as complex mathematical equations that described legal relationships across multiple dimensions of reality. Where humans relied on simple concepts like due process and equal protection, galactic law employed sophisticated algorithms that calculated justice probabilities to 47 decimal places. "The humans claim," Kexthari continued, his voice heavy with intellectual superiority, "that law should be accessible to those it governs, They argue that legal complexity creates inequality, and that justice requires clarity. Such primitive thinking demonstrates exactly why they are unfit to participate in sophisticated legal discourse. From the observation gallery, Dr. Sarah Kim watched the proceedings with barely controlled frustration. At 34, she was Earth's leading constitutional scholar and had spent the last 5 years studying galactic legal systems in preparation for this moment. What she had found was a system so complex that it had effectively eliminated justice in favor of intellectual masturbation. "Your Honor," she called out, activating her translation device, "if I may address the court?" The chamber fell silent. The idea that a human would dare speak in the grand chamber was so unprecedented that several of the temporal beings had to adjust their probability matrices to account for the impossibility. "You may not," Kekstari replied coldly. "This is a court of advanced legal reasoning, not a forum for primitive advocacy." "With respect, Your Honor," Kim continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court of Earth, "I have a doctorate in constitutional law from Harvard, a master's degree in comparative jurisprudence from Oxford, and I've spent 5 years studying your legal system. I believe I'm qualified to comment on its effectiveness." Effectiveness? Counselor Nexthurst's probability calculations flickered with confusion. "Our legal system has maintained galactic order for 10 million years. Its effectiveness is mathematically demonstrable." "Has it?" Kim asked. "Because from what I've observed, your legal system has created a situation where only beings with advanced degrees in trans-dimensional jurisprudence can participate in governance. You've effectively disenfranchised 97% of the galactic population. The masses are incapable of understanding sophisticated legal concepts." Magistrate Velduran replied dismissively. "Legal complexity exists to ensure precision and prevent the chaos that would result from popular participation in governance." "Or," Kim countered, "legal complexity exists to maintain the power of an intellectual elite that benefits from a system ordinary beings can't understand or challenge." The accusation hung in the air like an explosive charge. For 10 million years, the Galactic Legal Council had operated on the principle that complexity was inherently superior to simplicity, that sophisticated legal reasoning required sophisticated legal structures. The idea that this complexity might be a feature rather than a bug was literally inconceivable to beings who had built their entire existence around legal sophistication. This is precisely why humans are irrelevant to galactic jurisprudence, Kekstari declared, his voice resonating with final authority. They lack the intellectual capacity to appreciate the subtleties of advanced legal reasoning. They mistake simplicity for clarity and confuse accessibility with accuracy. "And you," Kim replied, her voice steady despite her growing anger, "mistake complexity for sophistication. You've created a system so complicated that it no longer serves justice, it serves lawyers." The chamber erupted in protests. The very suggestion that legal complexity might be counterproductive was heretical to beings who had spent eons perfecting the art of jurisprudential sophistication. "The petition is denied," Kekstari declared with finality. "Humans lack the intellectual development necessary to participate in galactic legal discourse. They may continue to be governed by our laws, but they have no standing to influence their creation." As the session ended and the various legal entities dispersed to their dimensions of existence, Kim remained in the observation gallery, staring at the chamber where her species had been declared irrelevant to their own governance. But rather than despair, she felt a cold determination settling in her chest. She had seen the galactic legal system from the inside now. She had studied its complexity, analyzed its procedures, and understood its fundamental assumptions. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who had dedicated her life to the pursuit of justice, that it was all built on a lie, The law was not meant to be incomprehensible. Justice was not improved by complexity. And sooner or later, the galaxy's legal system would collapse under the weight of its own sophistication, and when it did, humanity would be ready with an alternative. The first signs of systemic failure appeared 6 months later, though the Galactic Legal Council was slow to recognize them as symptoms of a deeper problem. What began as minor legal contradictions in the Outer Rim territories gradually escalated into full-scale jurisprudential paradoxes that threaten the stability of entire star systems. The situation is unprecedented, admitted Magistrate Vel Duran during an emergency session of the Council. Her temporal consciousness was flickering with uncertainty as she tried to calculate legal outcomes across multiple probability streams. We're seeing cases where compliance with one set of galactic regulations automatically violates another set, creating logical impossibilities. The problem had started small. Trade regulations that contradicted environmental protection laws, immigration policies that violated cultural preservation statutes, defense agreements that conflicted with non-aggression treaties. Each individual case had seemed manageable, solvable through the application of sophisticated legal reasoning and complex jurisprudential analysis. But as the contradictions multiplied, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The galactic legal system, in its pursuit of comprehensive coverage of every possible legal scenario, had created a labyrinth of laws so complex that they had begun to contradict themselves at fundamental levels. The Kepler colony situation exemplifies our predicament, reported Counselor Nexther, his probability-based existence struggling to calculate odds in a system that defied logical consistency. Galactic Environmental Protection Statute 47.3.11.8 Delta requires them to maintain 90% biodiversity on their world. However, Cultural Preservation Law 23.7.4.9 Gamma prohibits them from interfering with the natural evolution of indigenous species. The native apex predator is driving 3 protected species to extinction, creating a legal paradox where any action violates galactic law. Chief Magistrate Kexthari studied the case files with growing unease. His crystalline matrix, designed for perfect legal reasoning, was generating error messages as it tried to reconcile the contradictory requirements. Surely there must be a resolution through higher-order jurisprudential analysis? That's what we thought, Valderan replied grimly. But every solution we derive creates additional contradictions. The legal framework has become so complex that it's generating paradoxes faster than we can resolve them. The scope of the crisis was staggering. Across the galaxy, colonial governments were paralyzed by legal requirements that made governance impossible. Trade networks were grinding to a halt as regulations contradicted each other in ways that made legal commerce impossible. Even the Galactic Defense Force was struggling to operate under military codes that had become internally inconsistent. We need a comprehensive legal review, declared Kexthari. A complete analysis of the entire galactic legal framework to identify and resolve these systemic contradictions. How long would such a review take? Asked Counselor Nexther. Valderan's temporal consciousness calculated the probabilities. Given the current rate of legal complexity growth and the exponential nature of the contradictions, a complete review would require approximately 47,000 years to complete. And how long before the legal system becomes completely non-functional? Based on current trends, 18 months. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The galactic legal system, the foundation of civilization across 1,000 worlds, was collapsing under its own complexity. And they had less than 2 years to fix it before the galaxy descended into legal chaos. There must be a solution, Kexthari insisted. Some form of advanced jurisprudential analysis that can resolve these contradictions. It was Magistrate Zekmar of the Ethereal Advocates who voiced the unthinkable. Perhaps we need to consider alternative approaches to legal reasoning. What do you mean? The humans, Zekmar replied reluctantly. Their legal systems are primitive, but they've never experienced systemic paradoxes of this nature. Perhaps their simplistic approach to jurisprudence might offer insights into resolving these contradictions. The suggestion was met with horrified silence. The idea that the galaxy's most advanced legal minds might need to seek guidance from primitive humans was almost inconceivable. Absolutely not, Kexthari declared. We are not going to compromise the sophistication of our legal system by consulting with beings who think constitutional democracy represents advanced jurisprudence. But as the months passed and the legal contradictions continued to multiply, the Council found itself with diminishing options. Colonial governments were collapsing as legal paralysis made governance impossible. Trade networks were shutting down as commercial law became internally contradictory. Military forces were standing down as defense regulations contradicted themselves in ways that made any action legally impossible. The situation is becoming untenable, reported Velduran during another emergency session. We've now identified 47,000 distinct legal paradoxes, and the number is growing exponentially. Our most advanced jurisprudential A's are experiencing cascade failures trying to calculate legal compliance. What about the human petition? Asked Magistrate Zekmar quietly. What about it? They requested representation in galactic legal processes. Perhaps ... as a temporary measure. We could grant them limited consulting status. Not full representation, obviously, but access to review our legal framework and offer ... observations. The debate that followed was heated and prolonged. The very idea of allowing primitive humans to review sophisticated galactic law was anathema to beings who had spent eons perfecting jurisprudential complexity. But the alternative complete legal system collapse was even more unthinkable. Very. Well, Kexthari finally conceded. We will grant the humans limited consulting status. But let it be clear that this is a temporary measure, and their input will be subjected to rigorous analysis before any consideration for implementation. The message was transmitted to Earth's legal representatives with careful phrasing that emphasized the temporary and limited nature of human involvement. The Galactic Legal Council was not seeking partnership. They were simply allowing primitives to observe sophisticated legal reasoning action. Dr. Sarah Kim received the invitation with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation. She had been expecting this call for months, watching the reports of legal contradictions with the trained eye of someone who understood the fundamental flaws in the galactic system. Now she would have the chance to prove that human legal principles weren't just different from galactic law. They were better. Dr. Kim's first day in the Grand Chamber of Galactic jurisprudence was an exercise in controlled culture shock. The sheer scale of legal complexity on display was breathtaking and terrifying. Holographic displays showed legal frameworks that extended across 17 dimensions, jurisprudential matrices that required quantum computing to navigate, and precedential databases that contained more legal reasoning than had been produced in the entire history of human civilization. Impressive, isn't it? Kexthari observed, his crystalline form radiating intellectual superiority. This represents 10 million years of accumulated jurisprudential wisdom, the most sophisticated legal framework ever created. Kim studied the displays with the trained eye of a constitutional scholar. What she saw was indeed impressive and completely insane. How does anyone navigate this system? Only the most advanced legal minds can fully comprehend the subtleties, Kexthari replied proudly. It requires decades of specialized education and cognitive enhancements to achieve even basic competency in galactic jurisprudence. And what About the beings who have to live under these laws? How do they understand their rights and obligations? They don't, Counselor Nexther interjected. Is probability-based existence calculating legal outcomes in real time. The average galactic citizen relies on legal AI systems to determine compliance. Only trained jurisprudential specialists can interpret the actual law. Kim felt a chill of recognition. She had seen similar systems before legal frameworks so complex that they effectively excluded ordinary citizens from participation in their own governance. The difference was one of scale and sophistication, but the underlying principle was the same: complexity as a tool of control. Could you show me some of the paradoxes you're experiencing? She asked. For the next several hours, Kim was walked through case after case of legal contradictions that were paralyzing galactic civilization. Each individual case was mind-bogglingly complex, involving multiple layers of jurisprudential analysis and cross-dimensional legal reasoning. The aliens had approached each paradox as a sophisticated puzzle requiring equally sophisticated solutions. Kim approached them differently. This Kepler colony case, she said, studying the environmental versus cultural preservation paradox. You're treating this as a conflict between two equally valid legal principles, right? Correct, Valderan replied. Both environmental protection, Statute 47.3.11.8 Delta, and cultural Preservation Law 23.7.4.9 Gamma are fundamental elements of galactic jurisprudence. But what's the underlying purpose of each law? The question seemed to confuse the assembled legal minds. Purpose? Kexthari asked. What are these laws trying to achieve? What problem were they designed to solve? Environmental Protection Statute 47.3.11.8-Delta is designed to maintain ecological stability in colonial environments. Next, they're calculated. Cultural Preservation Law 23.7.4.9 Gamma is intended to protect the natural development of indigenous cultures from external interference. So both laws are trying to protect natural systems from harmful interference, Kim observed. They're not actually in conflict, they're working toward the same goal. The apparent contradiction disappears when you focus on purpose rather than procedure. The alien stared at her in incomprehension. The idea that legal complexity could be resolved through simplification was literally beyond their cognitive framework. But the specific requirements of each statute are mathematically incompatible. Valderan protested. The environmental law requires active intervention to prevent species extinction. The cultural law prohibits interference with natural development. Then you write a new regulation that addresses the specific situation, Kim replied. Something like, in cases where environmental protection and cultural preservation goals conflict, colonial administrators should seek solutions that serve both purposes through minimal intervention, consistent with indigenous cultural values. That's imprecise, Kexthari objected. It leaves too much discretion to local administrators. It gives them the flexibility to solve problems instead of being paralyzed by contradictory requirements, Kim countered. Law should enable good governance, not prevent it. Over the following days, Kim worked through case after case of legal paradoxes, applying human legal principles to problems that had stumped the galaxy's most sophisticated legal minds. In each case, her approach was fundamentally different from the aliens. Methodology. Where the galactic legal system tried to anticipate every possible scenario and create specific rules for each situation, human law established general principles and trusted people to apply them intelligently. Where alien jurisprudence sought precision through complexity, human law sought justice through clarity. You're oversimplifying, Kexthari protested after Kim had resolved another seemingly impossible legal contradiction. Legal precision requires specific guidance for specific situations. Legal precision requires that people understand what the law expects of them, Kim replied. If your law is so complex that only specialists can interpret it, then you don't have a legal system, you have a priesthood. The accusation struck home. The galactic legal system had indeed evolved into something resembling a religious hierarchy, with legal specialists serving as interpreters of incomprehensible sacred texts. Ordinary citizens had been reduced to supplicants, hoping that the legal priesthood would deliver favorable interpretations of laws they could never understand. But without complexity, how do you ensure comprehensive coverage of legal scenarios? Asked Magistrate Zekmar. Human law seems to leave too much to interpretation. Human law trusts human judgment, Kim replied. We establish basic principles, process, equal protection, fundamental rights, and we trust people to apply those principles fairly to new situations. We don't try to write a law for every possible scenario because we know that's impossible. And when people interpret the principles differently, then you have courts to resolve disputes, democratic process to change laws that don't work, and constitutional protections to ensure that basic rights aren't violated in the name of legal efficiency. The conversation continued for weeks as Kim worked through more and more of the legal paradoxes that were paralyzing galactic civilization. With each resolution, the aliens began to see a pattern in human legal reasoning that was both simpler and more effective than their own approach. You treat law as a tool rather than a science, observed Veldoran during one of their sessions. Law is a tool, Kim replied. It's supposed to help people live together peacefully and fairly. When law becomes so complex that it prevents good governance, it's not serving its purpose. But surely some level of complexity is necessary for sophisticated societies? Complexity should serve clarity, not replace it, Kim said. Good law is complex enough to handle real-world problems, but simple enough for real people to understand and follow. As word of Kim's success in resolving legal paradoxes spread through the galactic legal community, more and more aliens began to question the fundamental assumptions underlying their jurisprudential system. Perhaps complexity wasn't inherently superior to simplicity. Perhaps accessible law was more sophisticated than incomprehensible law, but the real test was yet to come. The crisis that finally broke the galactic legal system came without warning, striking at the very heart of galactic governance. It began with a routine review of the fundamental charter of galactic civilization, the basic constitutional document that had governed interspecies relations for 10 million years. This is impossible, Magistrate Veldoran announced during an emergency session, her temporal consciousness flickering with computational errors. The fundamental charter contains a logical contradiction so basic that it undermines the entire legal framework. The assembled legal minds studied the holographic display with growing horror. There, embedded in the most basic document of galactic law, was a paradox so fundamental that it made all subsequent legal reasoning meaningless. Article 1 establishes the principle of species sovereignty. Kexthare observed, his crystalline matrix struggling to process the contradiction. It states that each species has the inherent right to govern itself according to its own principles and values. And Article 3 establishes the supremacy of galactic law, added Counselor Nexthar. It states that all species are bound by galactic legal frameworks regardless of their internal governance systems. The two articles are mutually exclusive, Veldoran realized with dawning horror. If species have inherent sovereignty, they cannot be bound by external legal frameworks. If galactic law is supreme, then species sovereignty is meaningless. The implications were staggering. Every law, every treaty, Every legal precedent in galactic civilization was based on a foundational document that contradicted itself at the most basic level. The entire legal system was built on logical quicksand. How is this possible? Demanded Kexthari. The Fundamental Charter was reviewed by the greatest legal minds in galactic history. How could such an obvious contradiction go unnoticed? Because it wasn't obvious, Zekma replied grimly. The contradiction was buried under 10 million years of legal complexity. Each generation of lawyers found ways to work around the paradox, without addressing it directly. We've been building an elaborate legal structure on a foundation that doesn't exist. The crisis was immediate and total. If the Fundamental Charter was logically incoherent, then every law derived from it was equally invalid. Galactic civilization faced the prospect of complete legal collapse not in 18 months, but immediately. We need to convene a constitutional convention, Velduran announced. A complete rewriting of the Fundamental Charter to resolve these contradictions. Impossible, Kexthari replied. A constitutional convention would require unanimous consent from all member species. The legal and diplomatic complexity alone would take millennia to navigate. Then what do you suggest? The chamber fell silent as the greatest legal minds in the galaxy confronted the possibility that their entire system of jurisprudence was fatally flawed. 10 million years of accumulated legal wisdom had led them to this moment, paralyzed by their own sophistication, trapped by their own complexity. It was Dr. Kim who finally broke the silence. Maybe, she said quietly, it's time to try something different. All eyes turned to the human legal scholar who had been quietly observing the crisis unfold. Kim stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent her career studying constitutional law. You're trying to solve a fundamental design problem with superficial patches, she continued. The Fundamental Charter is flawed because it was written by committee over thousands of years, with each generation adding complexity without considering the overall logical structure. And you have a solution? Kexthari asked skeptically. I have a different approach, Kim replied. Instead of trying to patch the existing system, you start over with clear principles and simple language. You write a constitution that ordinary beings can understand and that establishes basic rights and responsibilities without trying to anticipate every possible scenario. That's primitive, Counselor Nexther objected. That's functional, Kim countered. Human constitutional law has governed complex societies for centuries without the kinds of logical paradoxes you're experiencing. Our approach isn't more sophisticated than yours, it's more effective. The debate that followed was intense and prolonged. The idea of abandoning 10 million years of jurisprudential development in favor of primitive human legal principles was almost inconceivable to beings who had built their entire existence around legal sophistication, but the alternative was civilizational collapse. Very well, Kexthari finally conceded. We will consider human constitutional principles as a potential framework for legal reform. But this is a temporary measure, and any proposed changes will be subjected to rigorous analysis. Actually, Kim replied, I think you need to do this differently. Constitutional conventions work best when everyone has an equal voice, regardless of their legal expertise. You need representatives from every species, not just legal specialists. Impossible, Velduran protested. Most species lack the cognitive capacity to understand constitutional law. Most species understand fairness, Kim replied. And that's what constitutional law is really about, creating fair systems that protect everyone's rights while enabling effective governance. The proposal that followed was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of a convention of legal experts, Kim suggested an assembly of ordinary citizens from every species in the galaxy. representatives who understood the practical problems of living under galactic law, not just the theoretical complexities of jurisprudential analysis. "This is madness," Kexthari declared. "You're proposing to entrust the foundation of galactic civilization to beings who have never studied law." "I'm proposing to entrust it to beings who have to live under law," Kim replied. "There's a difference." The Galactic Constitutional Convention that convened 6 months later was unlike anything in the history of galactic civilization. Instead of the crystalline perfection of the Grand Chamber of Galactic Jurisprudence, the assembly met in a simple amphitheater on Nexus Prime where representatives from 1,000 species could gather as equals. Kim stood at the podium, looking out at the most diverse gathering of sentient beings ever assembled for a single purpose. There were energy beings and silicon-based life forms, hive minds and individual consciousnesses, species that communicated through quantum fluctuations, and others that used simple chemical signals. "Delegates," she began, her words translated into 1,000 different languages and communication modes. "We're here to write a new constitution for galactic civilization. Not a complex legal framework that only specialists can understand, but a simple set of principles that every being in this galaxy can comprehend and follow." The work that followed was challenging but revelatory. Instead of starting with complex legal theories, Kim guided the delegates through basic questions about fairness, rights, and governance. What did each species need to thrive? What protections should every being enjoy? How could different civilizations coexist peacefully while maintaining their unique characteristics? "The fundamental principle," Kim explained during one of the working sessions, "is that government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Laws should serve the people, not the other way around." "But how do you ensure comprehensive coverage of legal scenarios?" asked Delegate Hicksmar of the Crystalline Collective. "You don't," Kim replied. "You establish clear principles and trust people to apply them fairly. When new situations arise that aren't covered by existing law, you have democratic processes to create new laws that follow the same principles." The concept of democratic participation was revolutionary to many species that had never experienced representative governance. For eons, they had been ruled by legal technocrats who claimed superior knowledge and therefore superior authority. The idea that ordinary beings could participate in their own governance was both terrifying and liberating. The beauty of democratic law, Kim explained to a group of delegates from authoritarian systems, is that it's self-correcting. If a law doesn't work, the people can change it. If a leader becomes corrupt, the people can replace them. The system evolves to serve the needs of the governed rather than the governors. As the weeks passed, the delegates began to embrace human legal principles with increasing enthusiasm. The concept of individual rights that applied to all beings, regardless of species. The idea of democratic representation that gave every civilization a voice in galactic governance. The principle of limited government that prevented any authority from becoming too powerful. "This is remarkable," observed Delegate Velkara of the Ethereal Union during one of the evening sessions. "Human legal principles are so elegant. They solve complex problems with simple solutions." "That's the point," Kim replied. "Good law shouldn't be complex for the sake of complexity. It should be as simple as possible while still being effective." The opposition came primarily from the legal establishment that had built its power on complexity and exclusivity. Kexthari and his allies argued that democratic governance would lead to chaos, that ordinary beings lacked the sophistication to make complex legal decisions. "You're proposing to replace 10 million years of jurisprudential wisdom with mob rule," Kexthari declared during one heated debate. "I'm proposing to replace 10 million years of legal tyranny with democratic governance," Kim replied. "The wisdom of experts is valuable, but it should serve the people, not rule them. The final document that emerged from the convention was both revolutionary and remarkably simple. The new Galactic Constitution established fundamental rights for all sentient beings, created democratic institutions for galactic governance, and set up systems for peaceful resolution of disputes between species. Most importantly, it was written in clear, simple language that any educated being could understand. Gone were the complex mathematical formulations and trans-dimensional legal reasoning. In their place were straightforward statements of principle that could be applied by ordinary people to real-world situations. We hold these truths to be self-evident, the Constitution began, borrowing language from Earth's own constitutional tradition, that all sentient beings are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The language was human, but the principles were universal. Every species could understand the basic concepts of fairness, freedom, and democratic participation that formed the foundation of the new legal system. The vote on ratification was overwhelming. Species after species endorsed the new Galactic Constitution, often with enthusiasm that surprised even Kim. The promise of accessible law, democratic participation, and protection of fundamental rights resonated across the galaxy in ways that complex jurisprudential theories never had. "The motion carries," announced the convention chairman, a dignified being from the Centauri system who had become one of Kim's strongest supporters. "The new Galactic Constitution is hereby adopted by a vote of 847 to 23, with 31 abstentions, as..." The cheers echoed through the amphitheater. Kim felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The galaxy had chosen democracy over technocracy, accessibility over complexity, human legal principles over alien sophistication, but she also knew that the real work was just beginning. Implementation of the new Galactic Constitution was swift and surprisingly smooth. The legal paradoxes that had paralyzed galactic civilization for months disappeared overnight as complex, contradictory regulations were replaced by simple, clear principles that people could actually understand and follow. "The efficiency gains are remarkable," reported Admiral Vex Ron of the Galactic Defense Force during the first post-Constitution briefing. "Our forces can now operate under clear rules of engagement that every soldier understands. We've eliminated the legal paralysis that was preventing effective military action." Similar reports came in from across the galaxy. Colonial governments that had been unable to function under contradictory regulations were now operating smoothly under clear constitutional principles. Trade networks that had ground to a halt due to incomprehensible commercial law were thriving under simplified, accessible regulations. "The most surprising result," observed Minister Kex Vala of the Galactic Commerce Commission, "is that simplified law is actually more effective than complex law. Businesses can plan for the future because they understand their legal obligations. Citizens can participate in governance because they understand their rights and responsibilities." The transformation wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Species that had been excluded from governance for millennia were now sending representatives to the Galactic Assembly. Ordinary beings who had never imagined having a voice in galactic affairs were running for office and winning elections. "Democracy is intoxicating," admitted Delegate Hicksmar of the Crystalline Collective during a session of the new Galactic Assembly. "For the first time in our species' history, we feel like we have control over our own destiny." The economic implications were equally profound. The simplification of galactic law had eliminated countless bureaucratic barriers that had been stifling trade and innovation. The new constitutional protections for property rights and contract enforcement had created an explosion of entrepreneurial activity. GDP across the galaxy has increased by 34% in the first year since constitutional implementation, reported Economic Minister Veltox during the annual review. Legal uncertainty was apparently a much larger drag on economic growth than anyone realized, but perhaps the most significant change was in the legal profession itself. The old system of legal technocrats who ruled through complexity had been replaced by a new generation of lawyers, who saw themselves as servants of justice rather than masters of obscure knowledge. Legal education has been completely transformed, observed Dean Kex-Mira of the Galactic Law Institute. Instead of teaching students to navigate complex regulations, we're teaching them to apply simple principles fairly and effectively. The result is a generation of lawyers who actually help people instead of mystifying them. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Chief Magistrate Kex-Thari had struggled to adapt to the new legal order, his crystalline matrix designed for complex jurisprudential reasoning struggling with the simplicity of constitutional principles. "This is not law," he complained during a private meeting with Kim. "This is popular opinion codified. Where is the sophistication? Where is the intellectual rigor?" "It's in the application," Kim replied patiently. "Constitutional principles are simple to understand but require wisdom and judgment to apply fairly. That's where the real intellectual challenge lies, not in creating complexity, but in achieving justice." Over time, even Kex-Thari began to see the benefits of the new system. Cases that had previously required years of complex legal analysis could now be resolved quickly and fairly using clear constitutional principles. The legal system was serving justice instead of serving lawyers. "I must admit," he told Kim during one of their regular consultations, "that the new system is effective, more effective than I thought possible." "Effectiveness was always the goal," Kim replied. "Law should work for people, not against them." The cultural exchange programs that followed the constitutional implementation were unprecedented in their scope and impact. Human legal scholars worked with alien jurists to develop best practices for democratic governance. Alien species shared their unique perspectives on rights and responsibilities, enriching human understanding of constitutional law. "The cross-pollination has been remarkable," observed Professor Valdana of the Comparative Constitutional Studies Institute. "Human democratic principles have been enriched by alien perspectives on collective decision-making, while alien societies have embraced human concepts of individual rights and limited government. The philosophical implications were perhaps the most profound. For the first time in galactic history, the relationship between rulers and ruled had been fundamentally redefined. Power flowed from the governed to the government, not the other way around. "We've discovered something remarkable," Kim explained during a lecture at the Galactic University. "Democracy isn't just about choosing leaders. It's about creating a system where power serves justice rather than justice serving power." The students representing dozens of species from across the galaxy listened with rapt attention as Kim described the theoretical foundations of democratic governance. Many came from societies that had never experienced representative government, where the idea of popular sovereignty was literally revolutionary. "But how do you prevent the tyranny of the majority?" asked a student from the hierarchical Dominion, a species accustomed to authoritarian rule. "Through constitutional protections for minority rights," Kim replied. "Democracy means majority rule with minority rights. The majority can govern, but they cannot violate the fundamental rights of minorities. And who enforces these protections? Independent courts that interpret the Constitution fairly, regardless of popular opinion. Judges who serve justice rather than politics." The legal education reforms that followed were comprehensive and transformative. Law schools across the galaxy abandoned their focus on complex jurisprudential theory in favor of practical training in democratic governance, and constitutional interpretation. We're not just training lawyers anymore, explained Dean Hicks Nara of the new Galactic Law Academy. We're training democratic citizens who understand their rights and responsibilities under the Constitution. The impact on legal practice was equally dramatic. The new generation of lawyers saw themselves as facilitators of justice rather than gatekeepers of complex knowledge. Legal services became accessible to ordinary beings who previously couldn't afford the expertise needed to navigate the old system. Legal representation is now a right, not a privilege, observed Public Defender Kexther during a conference on access to justice. Every being can understand their legal rights and obtain effective representation regardless of their economic status. The economic implications continued to unfold over the following years. The simplified legal system had eliminated countless sources of friction and uncertainty that had been hampering economic growth. Investment flowed more freely when investors could understand the legal framework governing their activities. The old system was a hidden tax on economic activity, noted economist Vel Krim of the Galactic Trade Institute. Complex regulations created compliance costs that were passed on to consumers. Legal uncertainty discouraged investment and innovation. The new constitutional system has eliminated these barriers to prosperity. The military implications were equally significant. The Galactic Defense Force, no longer paralyzed by contradictory regulations, had become more effective at maintaining peace and security. Clear rules of engagement had improved both military effectiveness and civilian protection. Our forces now understand exactly what they can and cannot do, reported General Dexmore of the Galactic Security Command. This clarity has improved military discipline and reduced civilian casualties while actually enhancing our operational effectiveness. But perhaps the most important change was in the relationship between different species. The old legal system had created a hierarchy where more sophisticated species dominated those deemed less advanced. The new constitutional system established genuine equality among all sentient beings. For the first time in galactic history, observed Ambassador Zeke Tara of the Interspecies Relations Commissions, every species has an equal voice in galactic governance. Decisions are made based on merit and consensus rather than claims of intellectual superiority. The success of human constitutional principles had not gone unnoticed beyond the galaxy. Reports began filtering in of other galactic clusters adopting similar democratic reforms, inspired by the transformation they had witnessed. Ripple effects are extraordinary, Kim told the Galactic Assembly during her annual constitutional review. Democratic principles are spreading throughout the local cluster. We've started a revolution in governance that extends far beyond our own galaxy. The opposition to the new system, while diminished, had not entirely disappeared. Some conservative factions continued to argue that complexity was inherently superior to simplicity, that democratic governance would inevitably lead to chaos and decline. You've replaced sophisticated jurisprudence with populist emotion, complained former Chief Magistrate Kexthari during a debate at the Constitutional Studies Institute. This system may work in the short term, but it lacks the intellectual rigor necessary for long-term stability. Time will tell, Kim replied calmly. But so far, the evidence suggests that democratic governance is both more stable and more effective than technocratic rule. People govern themselves better than experts govern them. The debate continued, but the results spoke for themselves. Crime rates had decreased as people understood and respected laws they had helped create. Economic growth had accelerated as legal certainty encouraged investment and innovation. International relations had improved as democratic governments proved more trustworthy partners than authoritarian regimes. The numbers don't lie, observed statistical analyst Hicks Vera of the Galactic Metrics Institute. Every major indicator of social, economic, and political health has improved since constitutional implementation. Democratic governance isn't just more fair, it's more effective. The educational implications were equally profound. The new Constitution's emphasis on democratic participation had sparked a renaissance in civic education. Citizens across the Kinzazurni galaxy were learning about their rights and responsibilities, participating in public debates, and engaging with the political process in ways that had been impossible under the old system. Civic engagement has increased by 400% since constitutional implementation, reported Education Minister Velkara. People are voting, attending public meetings, contacting their representatives, and running for office at unprecedented rates. Democracy has awakened a level of political participation we've never seen before. The technological implications were perhaps the most unexpected. The simplification of legal frameworks had accelerated technological innovation by reducing regulatory barriers and creating clearer intellectual property protections. Innovation cycles have shortened dramatically, observed Technology Minister Kekstara of the Galactic Innovation Council. When inventors understand their legal rights and obligations, they're more willing to take risks and invest in new technologies. The constitutional protection of intellectual property has created powerful incentives for innovation. The cultural implications were equally transformative. Species that had been marginalized under the old system of legal complexity were now contributing to galactic civilization in ways that had previously been impossible. We're seeing an explosion of cultural creativity, noted Cultural Minister Zikanara of the Galactic Arts Commission. When people feel empowered to participate in governance, they also feel empowered to express themselves culturally. Democratic societies are more creative societies. As the 5th anniversary of constitutional implementation approached, Kim found herself reflecting on the remarkable transformation that had taken place. The galaxy that had once dismissed humans as irrelevant to legal discourse had embraced human constitutional principles as the foundation of a new and more just civilization. The irony is remarkable, she observed during a private conversation with Kekstari, who had gradually become one of her closest collaborators. They called us primitive, but our legal principles proved more advanced than theirs. They called us irrelevant, but our ideas transformed their entire civilization. Perhaps, Kekstari replied thoughtfully, advancement isn't about complexity. Perhaps true sophistication lies in achieving maximum effectiveness with minimum complexity. Now you're thinking like a human, Kim replied with a smile. I consider that a compliment. The anniversary celebration was held in the same amphitheater where the Constitutional Convention had met 5 years earlier. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered to commemorate the document that had transformed their civilization and to reflect on the lessons learned. 5 years ago, Kim addressed the assembly, this galaxy was paralyzed by legal complexity. That served lawyers rather than justice. Today, we have a legal system that serves the people it governs. This transformation didn't happen because human ideas were superior to alien ideas. It happened because democratic ideas are superior to authoritarian ideas. The applause was thunderous, but Kim wasn't finished. The real lesson isn't about humans versus aliens. It's about the power of accessible law, democratic participation, and constitutional protection of fundamental rights. These principles work for any species in any galaxy at any level of technological development. As the ceremony concluded and the representatives returned to their worlds, Kim stood once again in the amphitheater where human legal principles had triumphed over galactic complexity. The transformation was complete, but she knew that the real work of democracy, the ongoing effort to make government serve the people, would continue forever. Dr. Kim, Kexthari approached, his crystalline form now modified to better interact with the democratic institutions he had once opposed. What do you think the future holds for galactic governance? Kim looked out at the stars visible through the amphitheater's transparent dome. I think the future belongs to any civilization wise enough to trust its people with power. Democracy isn't perfect, but it's the best system we've found for ensuring that government serves justice rather than the other way around. And the humans? What role will your species play in this new galactic order? The same role as every other species, Kim replied. Equal partners in the ongoing experiment of democratic governance. We proved that our legal principles could work on a galactic scale. Now we get to help everyone else make them work even better. As they walked through the halls of the Galactic Assembly, Kim reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Humanity had been dismissed as irrelevant to galactic jurisprudence, but human legal principles had become the foundation of a new and more just galactic order. The aliens had learned that complexity wasn't always superior to simplicity, that accessibility was more important than sophistication, and that democratic governance was more effective than technocratic rule. Most importantly, they had learned that true advancement lay not in excluding people from governance, but in empowering them to govern themselves. The greatest irony, Kim observed as they passed a group of young aliens studying human constitutional law, is that they thought we were too primitive to understand their sophisticated legal system. In the end, their system was too primitive to understand the sophisticated principles of democratic governance. And now? Kexthari asked. Now we're all learning together. That's what democracy is really about, the recognition that collective wisdom is superior to individual expertise, that the people are smarter than their leaders, and that government works best when it serves those it governs. The transformation was complete. The council that had called humans irrelevant had been replaced by a democratic system based on human constitutional principles. Galactic law had been rewritten according to human legal theory. And the galaxy was better for it. As Kim and Kexthari continued their walk through the halls of democratic governance, they passed monuments to the beings who had made the transformation possible, not just the human legal scholars who had provided the framework, but the alien delegates who had embraced democratic principles and the ordinary citizens who had made those principles work. The real heroes, Kim told a group of students who recognized her in the hallway, aren't the experts who design the system. They're the people who use it every day to make their societies more just and more free. The students, representing dozens of species from across the galaxy, nodded with the enthusiasm of beings who had grown up under democratic governance and couldn't imagine living any other way. To them, the idea that government should serve the people rather than the other way around wasn't revolutionary, it was simply obvious. That's the ultimate victory, Kim reflected as she and Kexthari reached the memorial hall honoring the Constitutional Convention. When democratic principles become so natural that people can't imagine living without them. When justice through law becomes not just policy, but culture. The memorial displayed the final vote tallies from constitutional ratification, the signatures of delegates from 1,000 worlds, and the simple but powerful words that had become the foundation of galactic governance. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all sentient beings are created equal ... Human words, Kexthari observed, but universal principles. The best human ideas always are, Kim replied. Democracy, individual rights, limited government, equal justice under law. These aren't specifically human concepts. They're principles that work for any species wise enough to embrace them. As they stood before the memorial, Kim felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The galaxy that had once dismissed humanity as irrelevant had been transformed by human legal principles. But more importantly, billions of beings across thousands of worlds now lived under governments that served them rather than ruled them. The Council had called humans irrelevant. In response, humanity had rewritten galactic law according to human constitutional principles. It was perhaps the most successful case of legislative advocacy in the history of the galaxy. So what's next? Kexthari asked as they prepared to leave the memorial hall. Next, we keep working, Kim replied. Democracy isn't a destination, it's a process. The work of making government serve the people never ends. As they walked back into the halls of the Galactic Assembly were representatives from 1,000 worlds debated the issues of the day according to human constitutional principles. Kim knew that the transformation was both complete and ongoing. The galaxy had embraced democratic governance, but the work of perfecting that governance would continue for generations to come. The humans had been called irrelevant. They had responded by making themselves indispensable, not through force or manipulation, but through the power of ideas that worked. Ideas that made government more just, law more accessible, and civilization more democratic. It was, Kim reflected, a very human way to win. 10 years after the implementation of the new Galactic Constitution, Dr. Sarah Kim stood before the Galactic Assembly to deliver her final address as Chief Constitutional Advisor. The chamber was packed with representatives from across the galaxy, beings who had grown up under democratic governance and saw constitutional law not as complex jurisprudence, but as the common-sense foundation of just society. Esteemed colleagues, she began, her words translated into 1,000 languages. When I first addressed this body 15 years ago, I was told that humans were irrelevant to galactic jurisprudence. Today, I stand before an assembly governed by human constitutional principles in a galaxy transformed by human legal theory. The irony was not lost on anyone in the chamber. The same aliens who had dismissed human law as primitive now sent their brightest students to study constitutional law at human universities. The legal principles that had been rejected as too simple were now taught in law schools across the galaxy as the pinnacle of jurisprudential wisdom. But the real victory, Kim continued, isn't that human ideas triumphed over alien ideas. The real victory is that democratic ideas triumphed over authoritarian ideas. That accessible law replaced incomprehensible complexity. That government of the people, by the people, and for the people became not just human aspiration, but galactic reality. The applause was sustained and heartfelt. In the audience, she could see Kexthari, now serving as Dean of Constitutional Studies at the Galactic University. Beside him sat dozens of former skeptics who had become advocates for democratic governance once they experienced its benefits. The lesson of the past decade, Kim concluded, is that sophistication lies not in complexity but in effectiveness. That true advancement comes not from excluding people from governance, but from empowering them to govern themselves. That justice is best served not by legal experts, but by constitutional principles that everyone can understand and apply. As she stepped down from the podium for the final time, Kim felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The galaxy had been transformed, not through conquest or coercion, but through the power of ideas that worked. Human constitutional principles had proven themselves superior not because they were human, but because they were just. The Council had called humans irrelevant. In response, humanity had rewritten galactic law and transformed galactic civilization. It was perhaps the greatest legislative victory in the history of the galaxy, achieved not through political maneuvering, but through the simple power of better ideas. As the assembly rose in a final standing ovation, Kim knew that her work was done. The galaxy was now governed by principles that she had helped to establish, principles that would endure long after she was gone, principles that proved, once and for all, that humans were anything but irrelevant to the cause of justice. The transformation was complete. The galaxy had learned to govern itself according to human constitutional law. and it was better for it.